Our speaker today is Dr. James Chamberlain. I met him the first time I remember, that was in Rotorua at the IUFRO All Division 5 conference on New Zealand back in 2003. So Jim was talking on rams in the Appalachians, I believe, and was going to do some fishing after that. More formally, Jim is a research scientist with the US Forest Service. He's a global expert on non-timber forest products management, production and valuation. He's done a lot of research focusing on the economic and ecological impacts of harvesting forest products that are not timber-based. That's what we're here to talk about, non-timber forest products, and in particular focusing on food and medicine. And Jim is, of course, a co-lead of the IUFRO Global Task Force that is hosting this webinar series here. He's got his PhD from the College of Natural Resources at Virginia Tech in 2000, focusing on managing forests for NTFPs. And he has published extensively on this, and also has recently been involved in producing a comprehensive national assessment in the US of these products relative to climate change. Jim has extensive experience working in South and Southeast Asia and in Central Europe. And prior to his employment with the Forest Service in the US, he was president of the Nitrogen Fixing Tree Association, a non-governmental organization that promotes research and technology transfer of multipurpose trees to improve agroforestry productivity. But today, we're here to hear him talk about non-timber forest products and the bioeconomy in a US perspective. So with that, I will give the floor to you, Jim. Please take over.
Thank you, Karsten. Appreciate great introduction. It was a long time ago that we first met, memorable times. Thank you all for being here. Like Karsten said, I'm Jim Chamberlain. I'm a research scientist with the US Forest Service, and I focus on particularly food and medicine. What I want to talk to you today is about give you my perspective on non-timber forest products in the bioeconomy in the US. Let me first state really clear that as a federal employee, I do not advocate nor critique national policy related to any subject. Any statements I make regarding policy are based on my research and observations made. They do not reflect the federal government. I make reference to policy for educational purposes only and to explain the environment at this time. I'm not involved in dialogue at the national level on the bioeconomy, and my statements on the bioeconomy are based on review of published literature and reflect my interpretations. With that, let me talk to you today. Today, I want to break this down into three separate pieces to the presentation. First, I want to talk about the NTFPs in the US and give you kind of an overview of the cultural and economic perspectives, talk about the products, the volumes, and the product markets. Then I want to switch gears and talk about sort of the US bioeconomy and the focus of our strategies and review of the literature and sort of where I see the bioeconomy in the United States based on much of the literature that's out there. And then third, I want to turn our attention to sort of NTFPs and the US bioeconomy and focus on two different frameworks that have been put out there. One by Boog, we'll talk, that was 2016, and more recently by Pipolani and Smith and Hall in 2022. And then I want to end this with sort of a discussion of how do we go from here to a integrated, sustainable bioeconomy with non-timber forest products. So the United States has a deep cultural connection to the plants that are harvested for their non-timber values. Like many countries that we all work in, the US has a very deep cultural connections to the plants that provide these products. In Hawaii, for example, there are over 140 species of forest plants that have been identified that are currently and actively harvested and gathered. Two examples are in this photo on the upper left-hand corner. You see people using banana leaves. This is for cooking, the traditional cooking methods. And the women dancers, the hula dancers that you see in the lower left corner, are adorned with leaves around their necks that are collected from the forest. And actually a good portion of them are imported from the South Pacific Islands. About $5 million worth of those leaves are imported and sold every year. If we move north to Alaska, by law, residents of Alaska are provided reasonable access to subsistence resources, including non-timber forest products on public lands. So the subsequent harvest of NTFPs is a cultural tradition with important economic implications. The harvest provides traditional connections to place, belief, and history. And so the informal NTFP-based economy is very prevalent throughout the country, as well as the formal markets for these products. So there's really you see a combination of both informal and formal economies. All the way across the nation, from bear grass in the Pacific Northwest that is harvested and used for traditional baskets, and to source the international floral industry is harvested, to birch sap, which you see coming from the upper Midwest, which is really an emerging market for a new product. But more traditionally, birch bark has been used for baskets and for canoes, and it's still very prevalent in the sort of niche specialty markets that you see, to including the wood of the baskets from the eastern band of the Cherokee, from white oak baskets that you see in the lower right-hand corner. Interestingly enough, the per unit value of that wood that's used in those baskets far exceeds the value of that wood for a timber-based product. So if you look at on a pound by pound basis, that wood is much more valuable in baskets than it is for, say, barrel staves. For me, ramps are the epitome of a forest foods. Some forest foods may contribute more to the economy, as we'll see in a moment. Some may be more widespread, but I think ramps kind of embrace the whole cultural economy of forest products. Just the three names that you see really illustrates the depth of the connection. The middle name, the Native American term for ramps, really connects us to the traditions that started when humans first began interacting with this plant many millennia ago. The upper name, ramps, that we know commonly, that connects us to the immigrants who came here from Northern Europe and brought with them knowledge of this plant that was handed down to them through their ancestors through many, many years. And then the lower name connects us with science, and the science that is involved in figuring out how to manage these products in perpetuity, so that we can, our ancestors and our progeny can continue to enjoy them. The person in that photo is a Native American friend of mine, is working with the Forest Service to figure out what are the impacts of harvesting and how do we sustainably source that. And it really is emblematic of the need for all of us to be working together to figure out how to make this happen. But so today, ramps are deeply embedded in the cultural economy of the region and across the nation, with improved marketing and infrastructure. For example, internet sales and overnight shipping. Those ramps can be growing in North Carolina and be eaten in the Pacific Northwest or pretty much anywhere in the world within days. But it all starts with local people doing what they really enjoy, and that's getting out in the woods and harvesting this plant and then sharing it with other people. So every year, community groups come together to celebrate spring and the emergence of this plant of ramps, and they organize dozens of festivals across the country that are organized every year. Some are small, organized by churches and community groups, mainly for those people. Others are large and attract people from hundreds of miles around, and they all contribute to a bio-based economy. In fact, the foundation for a bio-based economy are those local people that are harvesting and contributing to their economy with that plant. Yet ramps may be emblematic for me, but they are only one piece of the pie. Many other forest foods contribute to the formal and informal economy. Food and medicine that's harvested from our forest directly impacts people's health, their nutrition, and their food security. And they indirectly impact people's livelihood through the generation of income. And sustainably sourcing all of those products is essential to making sure that we integrate into a sustainable bioeconomy. Allow me to focus on Eastern United States for a moment. The forests of Eastern United States are some of the most biologically diverse temperate hardwood forests in the world. In fact, the Southern Appalachia forest that you see in this dark blue, can you see my cursor in this dark blue area down here, are basically the source of most of the medicinal forest products that we see on the market today. In fact, that dark blue area that I pointed out represents the concentration of harvesting of American ginseng, which is really the iconic medicinal forest product that we have. Interestingly enough, this map is possible because we have data on American ginseng dating back to early 1970s when it was listed on CITES. Unfortunately, we had the data for others is lacking. We have been making progress though. And these maps over the last 5 years, we've been trying to figure out how we can track other medicinal plants. And you can see by these maps that clearly the core of the forest-based economy for medicinal plants is in Central and Southern Appalachia. So let's move on to just some brief examples of the value and the volume of product that's coming out. Maple syrup is a global market with local origins. In the United States, it's valued at about $140 million a year. Most of the production is coming from the Northeast. If you can see my cursor up in this area here, it's from New England and the upper right-hand portion of that map. Yet there's a strong economic development of maple syrup production in the southern states. So down in Virginia and West Virginia and Kentucky, interestingly enough, so the forest-based economy is expanding, even though predictions are of the impact that climate change has on the product indicates a shrinking source base. So this iconic edible forest product, may be challenged in the future if you look at these predictions of the climate change and where the habitat is moving. Wild blueberries, another example of some non-timber forest products, are actually managed natural populations which are marketed as such to capture more benefit. Production over the last 20 years has been fairly steady. The average annual harvest for 1998 to 2000 was about 80,000 pounds a year. And for the last 3 years, from 2016 to 2018, it was about 73,000 pounds a year. So over the same period, imports have exceeded exports to the tune of about $17 million a year. So there's an international component to our NTFP-based economy as well. And there's potential to increase production of that product. Moving on, the two main public agencies, the National Forest and the Bureau of Land Management, issue permits for the harvest of non-timber forest products. This table that you're looking at summarizes the average annual receipts for those permits in thousands of 2019 dollars. Bottom line, the average annual receipts increased in the period of 2009 to 2013, but then it has dropped over the last 5-year period to about, well, if you look at the bottom line, about $7.7 million worth of receipts have been generated by the Forest Service and by the BLM. Interestingly enough, if you extract from that data and look at the estimated wholesale value of non-timber forest products for the period 2004 through 2018, you see that it's declining. Now, you have to realize that this is based on permits for the harvesting and not necessarily the harvest itself or how much is sold. And it's based on only the public land, so it does not represent private land production. If we extend that to look at the estimated wholesale value adjusted for trade over that same period of time, we see that actually the value has been increasing since about 2012, 2013. Now, the annual US per capita consumption of non-timber forest products is the red line that you see, and of non-wood forest products, so we just take out the wood part of that. It ranges from about, well, $5 per person in 2004 to a little bit more than $6 per person. Now, how does that compare to the rest of per capita consumption of food and beverages? It represents probably 0.13% of food and beverages. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but for some people, that's pretty significant. And where are they spending this money? That's the big question I have now. And so we look at total resale values, and I'm going to speed up. You can see a major increase in retail sales of herbal supplements, which includes forest products and non-forest products, and it includes cultivation and natural population harvesting. So where are they focusing on? These 7 products are all forest products. They're all based in forest, and they represent about 5% of the total retail sales. And so the retail sales of these 7 species that you're looking at here are about 5% of the total retail sales of herbal products. Most of the medicinal plant market is made up of small and medium-sized firms. In fact, about 80% of the production is small and medium-sized firms. So clearly there is a significant positive impact from harvesting, but there's also some questionable evidence. There's evidence that the impact is not having a positive impact as well. So you see, we derived a supply curve for American ginseng, and in fact, it is acting like a common resource product that is being overexploited and over-harvested. So let's now turn to the second phase of this discussion. And I'm running low on time. I spent too much time on our background. So I did a quick search of bioeconomy in the United States and the Web of Science, and I found that disproportionately biotechnology and applied microbiology articles and pieces covered about 22% of the 200 articles and publications found. And then energy and fuel was about 22%, environmental sciences 11%, and green sustainable technology about 11%. About 7% was focused on forestry. So I delved into those 14 articles a little bit more, and this illustrates the kind of coverage those articles had. And you see wood pellet supply, biomass planting, bioenergy traits, potential for woody biomass in the Corn Belt, trees and woody biomass production on marginal lands. So really shows you that the focus of the forestry literature and bioeconomy in the US is really focused on bioenergy. I was interested then, how does that compare to the global literature? So I did a quick search on the Web of Science using just bioeconomy, came up with almost 4,700 publications. Interestingly enough, environmental sciences was about 18% of that large body of knowledge versus 22% in the United States. About 16% focused on biotechnology as opposed to 22% in the United States. Green sustainable science was about 14% as opposed to 11%. Interestingly enough, forestry was about 7% in the global literature and about 7% in the US literature. Bracco and co-authors recently published a review of national frameworks to assess the contribution of bioeconomy to total economy. And they examined a number of national strategies, and you can see that here. The last column was the United States. Interestingly enough, out of the 17 sectors that you see, the United States addressed about 30% of them. Conversely, Argentina covered about 65%, and Germany about 88%. So clearly, the literature in the US is focused on biotechnology. And I put this up here just to remind you that I'm not criticizing or making any disclaimers about our literature about this, but I'm just presenting the facts. In 2012, the National Bioeconomy Blueprint was published by the White House. It focused on health, energy, agriculture, environment. The strategic objectives were to strengthen research and development, advance movement of product from laboratory to market. In 2018, the Biomass Research Board, an interagency task force, created and published the implementation framework that you see here. Their vision was to enhance economic growth, energy security, and environmental quality by maximizing sustainable use of our nation's domestic biomass resources. The collaborative goals focused on advancing algae systems for bioenergy, feedstocks for bioenergy, biomass conversion, and transportation, etc. They focused on the bioeconomy relative to this implementation framework was economic activity driven by research and innovation in the life science and biotechnology, enabled by technological advances in engineering and computing. And you can see that it focused on biomedical, bioindustrial, and agriculture. Clearly, if you're taking the vision by Boog et al. In 2016, you see that this really focuses on a biotechnology vision, where economic growth and creation are the main aims. Application of biotechnology is the value creation, and the drivers are research councils and funders. If you look at that same vision, I suggest that non-timber forest products really focus on sort of the vision of a bioecology, where sustainability, biodiversity conservation of ecosystems is the main objectives. Development of integrated production systems are where value creation is, and et cetera. So now I moved myself to look at this global framework that Piccolani and Smith Hall produced. And they boil it down to 7 questions, which you can see along the left-hand column. They focused on timber and medicinal plants, timber in Finland and medicinal plants in Nepal. And you can see this, that ecological modernization with neoliberal influence was the major paradigm belief system for timber. And in the medicinal plant example, ecological modernization, a resource to improve livelihood and biodiversity conservation. So I went through these same questions and answered them as best as I could. And one, the paradigmatic belief system for food and medicine was natural resources to improve livelihood while conserving biodiversity. The public policy goal, in my opinion, was sustainable forest management for food and medicine to improve the livelihood of people and at the same time improve forest health and resistance. What the products that were focused on, as you can see in the Finland example, was timber, wood products. In Nepal, it was 300 species traded. And in the US, there's countless native species that are traded formally and informally as commodities or specialty products and consumed directly and indirectly. The stakeholders in the US are native and non-native harvesters, producers, traders, NGOs, resource managers, consumers, industry that are dispersed locally, regionally, nationally, and even globally. The informal economy is significant and may exceed the formal market, though no overall valuation of either market economy has been done to my knowledge at this time. The likely transition pathways are sustainable and inclusive forest management, and increased forest farming and cultivation, increased market access and competitiveness, capacity and infrastructure improvement are the major transition pathways that I see. And the strength of the link to environmental sustainability is basically forest foods and medicines are essential to our culture and to our society, and sustainability of the environment whence these natural resources originate is crucial. So in a nutshell, you can see there the summary using the global framework that Piccolani and Smith Hall published. If you have not seen this article, I highly recommend it. And the final slide I'd like to present is a matrix that a small team of us put together for the upcoming World Forest Congress. And it looks at how do you move from where we're at to the full integration into sustainable bioeconomy. And it looks at really 2 pathways. One, vertical integration, and 2, the horizontal integration. Vertical integration that moves from small scale, low tech producers to large industrial complexes with associated technology innovation, where moving horizontally, integration goes from production with low transparency to one with reliable data. And I suggest that, in fact, it's not an either or type of movement, but a combination of both vertical integration and horizontal integration. So if you look at the walnut forests in Kyrgyzstan, we would classify that as sort of a weak vertical and weak horizontal. It has small scale, low tech processors. There's low product quality, lack of standards. There's a little training or skills of expertise. You have limited or no transparency of data. But then if you move into the upper right-hand corner where you see cork from Portugal and Spain, that industry is organized. There are associations, there's advanced silviculture to to improve sustainable production. Many years ago, I think in the early 20th century, there was national legislation passed to support the cork industry. So there's this movement to the upper right-hand corner that really indicates how do we get full integration into a sustainable bioeconomy. And with that, I'm going to stop here. I've gone over my 30 minutes that I've been trying to, and I'd like to open it up to questions at this time.
Thanks a lot for that, Jim. That was really great. I mean, thanks a lot for having the focus very clearly on both non-timber forest products and the bioeconomy. I think that the webinar series here is all about that and making those connections. So it was great that you had that focus. Also great to see your use of illustrations, photos and maps. I think very helpful, and also showing this diversity of plants in terms of species and products, a diversity of uses and users, a diversity of cultural connections and economic contributions. I see a lot of interesting similarities here with some of the other speaks we've heard in the webinar series here, right? In the US case here, small producers, lack of forest focus in relation to the bioeconomy at present, and the usual biotech dominance in interventions and plant interventions. And perhaps most interesting, I think, was to see this call for a need for a bioresource oriented approach to the forest-based bioeconomy in the US. I think that was really interesting to see and operational. Let me just encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A. I'm sure, I mean, we have a lot of people. We have 150 people with us here. I'm sure many of you have questions. Do use the Q&A for that. Because I'll just be asking Jim the questions as they pop up in the Q&A. So let me get going on that. So we have the first question here from Mike Reichenbach. He says, I noted in one of your slides that there may be a shift to privatization of the public values and maybe the public resources offered from NTFPs. Keyword neoliberalism. What shifts have you seen over your career? So
give me that one again. So what shifts have I seen in
yeah, he talks about.
It's really interesting, actually, you say that, because back in I got involved in this back in the mid 1990s, and actually, non-timber forest products in general in the United States really started taking off in the early 90s, even though they were in the management plans for national forests before that. It wasn't until the early 90s that people really stood up and started realizing that there was another natural resource in the forest that people were using. And over that time, and I use ramps as an example, I have seen tremendous growth in interest and in demand for ramps over the last 20 years. You know, people now are harvesting tens of thousands of pounds of these plants every year. But I also see a movement now so the traditional way of harvesting was to dig the whole plant up. And I see more and more people now advocating just to cut the leaves off of the plant and to leave the below ground biomass intact. And a little short story on that, I was in Ukraine years ago, and I was talking about my research on ramps to my colleagues, and they said, oh, well, we have that same plant here, and we'll show you that. And sure enough, they have the same genus, different species, but it's essentially the same plant. And we got talking about harvesting, and I explained to them that in most cases, harvesting of these plants in the US, people are digging the whole plant up. And they asked me, why do you do that? Because our traditional method of doing it was just to clip the leaves off, and then we get a flush of of leaves the next year. And so I find that very encouraging to see that now people in the US are really advocating for just using the above ground biomass.
All right, Lauren would like also to comment on this question. So Lauren, please.
Oh, I don't have a comment. I was just checking.
Okay, good. Okay. So let's go to the next question. That's from Robert Healy. He asks, you don't seem to include NTFP-based tourism, right? And if you did that, your numbers would be far higher. For instance, considering maple syrup tourism in Vermont and Quebec.
That's a good point, because now I really focus on the plants and the fungi that are harvested. But I think, yeah, there's a huge economy based on tourism that really needs to be included in the valuation of this non-timber forest product based economy. I agree with you that I just haven't got to that point of embracing the tourism factor as well. But it's big.
Yeah, it could be something like maybe even doubling values or something.
Oh yeah,
right?
easily. Yeah. Easily. So I put up, maple syrup, $140 million. They're the second largest maple syrup festival in the country is about 2 hours north of here. And every year they bring in hundreds of thousands of people come to this one community and tour the different maple bushes and syrup facilities. So yeah, it's very valuable.
Thanks, Jim. Next question is from our colleague, Maria Teresa Pulidor Silva. And she's asked, in the US, is there any government support to promote the bioeconomy?
Is there any what?
Government support to promote the bioeconomy.
Oh, support.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the priority right now of the bioeconomy from the government is really focused on biotechnology, the medical profession, the health, agricultural inputs. And I think there is support coming around to sort of food and medicine and non-timber. We just haven't really defined the bioeconomy to include food and medicine and non-timber forest products. So, from a pure definition, we're not supporting that, but we just haven't defined it as part of the bioeconomy. Does that make sense? So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, there is support for this, but we just don't call it a bioeconomy at this point.
So maybe in relation to this question, I'm just going to jump down a bit in the question list here. So Seng Wan from Canada asks, he says, thank you for the highly interesting presentation. But in addition to strategies at the federal level, are there any strategies at the state level in terms of promoting NTFPs in the bioeconomy?
I am sure that there are states that are promoting the use of these. I don't see it very prevalent out there, but I'm sure that there are states that recognize the importance of the products. And I go back to this example of maple syrup in Highlands County, just north of here. The state certainly promotes that and supports it and encourages it. The county chamber of commerce supports it and encourages it. But I'm not seeing anything formal saying we're going to support a bioeconomy. I think states recognize the value of some of these plants and these products, and they take appropriate actions.
So it sounds like there's not a lot of public investment then.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah. Maybe the situation.
And I think that's, I think that is prevalent around the world. I think you see that. It's just such an emerging kind of concept that, you know, we're ahead of the wave, so to speak, or we're pulling it along.
Yeah. There's a question here from Charles McClure. Sorry if I don't pronounce your names correctly. He says, since a lot of timber corporations have sold their lands, who will be doing the research in the areas of nanofibers and chemistry? I'm not sure I see the connection between timber corporation and research in nanofibers and chemistry, but maybe you know about that. Maybe I'm just not familiar with the case, the US
I think
case.
most of the research that I see in nanofiber right now is coming out of the federal government's very much involved in, like the Forest Service has Forest Products Lab up in Wisconsin. It's a very strong program in nanofiber. I think that's really the driving force right now behind some of the forestry and bioeconomy research that's coming out. And it's really being driven by the universities and by, like I said, government laboratories like the Forest Lab, Forest Products Lab. Yeah, I mean, I think the research community, the forest products research community really sees the value of molecular biology, molecular chemistry, and deriving products from wood to address those biotechnology innovations that are important for driving a forest-based bioeconomy or wood-based bioeconomy.
All right, thanks. We have a question here from Kristen Bergstrand. Now we're going into the details, Jim, here, right? So he asks, did you say a detailed question here. Did you say birch syrup is an emergent opportunity in the upper Midwest? What was the species of oak you mentioned was more economical in baskets versus barrel staves? I assume white oak, but would other similar oak species like bur oak work in that basket product? And why are the baskets popular and where they're purchased?
So yes, birch sap in general is really an emerging market right now. A lot of people are putting efforts into developing birch sap, walnut, sycamore, variety of other tree sap. So really there's a large and a significant focus on developing those products for economic development. White oak is the preferred basket making for the Eastern Band of the Cherokee and for other artisans, mainly because it has tyloses in it and it's easy to split, right? And so they make splits out of it. They're looking for straight bowls that are 3 to 4 feet long, so a meter long, that are 8 to 10 inches in diameter with no knots. And then they split that down into really fine pieces, thin pieces before they make it into baskets. Why is it more valuable? Well, most of the baskets that I'm talking about are put together by an association or a guild of basket makers in Western North Carolina, and they're very cherished by a lot of people because it's a traditional method of making baskets. It's very time consuming, and they can sell for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars.
Wow. Yeah.
Did I answer that technical question?
I think so. To the best of my knowledge, you did. Thanks.
Thank you.
Next question is from Dana Nilsson, asking, referring to the last slide with the matrix. Are there other examples of strong besides cork in Spain and Portugal? And is this a good model for rams or in the US or elsewhere? And if it is a good model for rams, then how do you move up there into the strong quarter?
Can I go back here? Can you still see that?
We don't see your slides,
Okay,
so you need to put it on again.
let me see if I can put it on again.
So the question is very much about what is needed to move upwards, right?
Right,
To that upper right-hand corner there.
there, can you see that now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I go back to the cork example, you know, somebody in that national leadership recognized the value of cork back in the early 1900s, so the early 20th century, and they created national legislation that supported development of the industry. And from that, they have supported research and development. There's market support for it. There is organization of producers and processors. So it's really, I think you can use that as a really good model to say, okay, how do you take an example like cork that is now actually from a technological innovation regard has been very significant. So it's more than just the cork that you have in wine bottles and that, but it's also used in insulation. It's used in, I believe, in the space shuttles for insulation. My friend Sven Mutke, who's in Spain, could tell you much more about that. But you ask whether there are other models.
No, I think the first part of the question is where would you place ramps in this?
Oh, where would I place ramps? I think yeah, I would place ramps probably down close to the walnut Kyrgyzstan model that we see.
And then the next part of the question is what interventions are needed to transit up to the core area?
To move up to that, yeah. I think in particular, if we look at just ramps, if we look at, we need to know how much is being harvested out there. We need transparency of data to show that this is how much is being harvested. This is how much can be harvested on a sustainable basis. I think that's one of the first major pieces, contributions that we need to move it up that diagonal scale that we see. And then I think we need to see sort of more integrated production systems. And we're getting there in that more and more people are trying to figure out how to cultivate ramps. If you think about ramps, it's an onion. It's in the same genus as garlic. It's the same genus as 600 other species of allium. So the knowledge can be developed to cultivate it, to actually farm it in the forest. And more people are trying to do that now. So as we build that kind of knowledge base where we can integrate production of ramps into a forest, I think you'll see it start moving towards that upper right-hand corner. And I would say that's true for most food and medicine that's being foraged from our forests. Is one, we need to know how much is being harvested, how much can be harvested, and then how do we produce those sustainably in a forest setting.
Yeah. I think it would be really interesting to see more examples of cases in this model, and then also to take it to the next level, right? I mean, try to gain a better, more detailed understanding of what are the bundle of activities that go into transition pathways. I mean, moving up there into the right-hand corner.
Absolutely.
And maybe we should mention here that we are organizing an event, a session on transition pathways in 2023 at the All Division 5 conference in Australia next year.
Yes.
The call is not out yet, but we'll make sure to post it on the website and so on, right? And also mention it here, right?
But it would be really interesting to take this matrix and have people who are on this webinar or in the task force or anybody and started looking at your products and see where you would put it in this matrix so that we can expand the matrix and expand our understanding of these examples, because these are just illustrative examples that the authors were able to identify and figure out where they would be.
All right, thanks, thanks, Tim. That's yeah, a lot to do with this, right? I mean, moving forward on the framework here for sure.
Yeah.
Next question is from Pisada Istiak, asking, as you know, most NTFPs are consumed by people living in proximity to forests and do not enter formal value chains or markets. How can we estimate the contribution of these products in the bioeconomy?
Good point.
That's
really,
a difficult one, right?
I think I think globally that's one of the big challenges, because a lot of these products don't get into the don't get into the formal market. So they're valuable in the informal market, and they're valuable to the person or the family or the household that's consuming them. But how do you figure out how valuable they are? I think there are a couple ways you could do. You can look at opportunity costs that are not costs because they don't have to go out and buy food. So you can look at how much food they're consuming and say, okay, if they went out and bought that equivalent amount of food, how much would it cost them in dollars or cents? And then you could also look at calorie intake. You could figure out how much a typical person has to consume in food, and then look at how much food that person is consuming that is being foraged from the forest, and look at it, relatively speaking, to how many calories they're intaking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, in the past decade, a lot of work has gone into developing these valuation methods for subsistence forest products.
Right.
Starting with the work of William Cavendish back in 2003. And those of you that are interested in these techniques, then I very much recommend the book called Measuring Livelihoods. That's edited by Art Ankelsen and some other people, including myself. And in that book, we go through these methods. And we recommend also which methods to use in what situations to put a value on subsistence products. So I think the methods there are fairly well developed. I think what we don't know so much about is how do we link it up to the bioeconomy? How do we bundle it into transition pathways? So that's more of an unknown, I would say. Next question is from Justine Mwanje. That's a lot of questions there. I don't think we have time for all of them. So she's asking 3 questions. So I'll just take the first one, assuming that's the most important. How could culture be used to sustainably manage and conserve NTFPs?
How could what?
Culture.
Culture.
Yeah.
Well, I think we need to recognize, I think the way culture comes into this whole scenario is that it really provides the mesh, the core connection to these resources. And so building on people's connection to their resources, to me, is essential. Right? If we don't recognize the cultural connection, we may not recognize that the plant is getting used or even harvested. Right? If you look back at ramps were really not an issue in the United States until the early 1990s, when somebody said, "Oh, this is really important. These festivals that are going on, these cultural events that are going on every spring are valuable to the communities." And I think that's what really started, for me at least, really started bringing it home that there is this cultural connection to these plants. You know, I think there's a stronger cultural connection to the plants for food and medicine than there really is for timber.
Yeah, and just if we link back to the previous question about valuation, then we know a lot about how to value subsistence forest products, but we do not know how to value cultural contributions. So that's really an area where we need to go. I mean, if we and develop our methods, and we just don't know how to do that. So
right, we don't have that experience. Yeah.
Next question is from Dawn Suter, asking. Oh, let me just make sure I didn't skip one. Sorry. Sorry, something happened here to my. So next question is from James Rasman. Do you know of examples where private landowners are being paid for NTFPs being harvested off their land?
It's a good question. I see that more and more in the discussions where people are getting paid. I was just on a call a couple months ago with a large landowner in Appalachia, southwest of here, and they were asking that exact question: how can we be paid, or how can we receive leases for access to harvesting plants? I think you see that in other products like pine straw, which is the needles of pine trees that are used as mulch. And so people will lease their access to their land, you know, for harvesting of pine straw. I mean, I think you see that with maple syrup probably and other products. It's not widespread, and I think one of the challenges with it is, you know, I think one of the challenges with it is basic economics, that the plants themselves are not of high value. So, and the people that are harvesting them are economically marginal. So getting them to be able to pay more for access is a challenge. I think it needs to be done. I think we need to look at it and figure out how to do it. I think a lot of people, I've heard of actually taxing people that are harvesting, you know, as one way of getting more income or more realizing the economic benefits of these plants.
And I see that James Rasman has a related question here also. Let's take it together with this one. So asking, how much forest management is being done to increase the production of non-timber forest products?
Well, I think relative to the priorities that forest management has right now, I think there's an effort to do that. I don't know how much is being done. You know, I looked at 20 years ago, I looked at the forest management plans for all of the national forests in eastern United States. There were 32 of them, 31, 32, something like that. And about 7 of them, maybe a third, actually had non-timber forest products as part of the management plans. I thought that was pretty good, because back in the 80s, when these forest management plans were created, these products weren't a priority. Nowadays, they're much more of a priority, and people are trying to figure out how to do that. So I think it's coming along. You know, it's going to take years before it's fully integrated, but I think there's strong interest in it, and you know, people are trying to figure out how to do it.
Can you say a few words about the chapter that Michel Balazzo, you and others wrote for the forthcoming book on this particular issue?
Yeah, actually, I've been involved in several pieces that look at sustainable forest management for non-timber forest products. And I think there are examples from around the world. Clearly, the silviculture can be adapted to co-produce products. You know, so it doesn't have to be excluded. Non-timber forest products can be integrated into the silvicultural practices and techniques to actually manage for both. And we show that in one of these chapters that we're working on in the book, where basic silvicultural prescriptions, where you're thinking about the impacts that silviculture has on light and water that is getting to the forest floor, and how that impacts the production of non-timber forest products, is certainly possible. And clearly, the silvicultural techniques are there that can be used to manage for both, manage for everything.
All right, thanks, Jim. So I can see time is running and our hour is up, but there's still a lot of questions in the Q&A. Would you be willing to respond to these, Jim? These questions? If
I'll stay. I'm welcome to stay on for a few more minutes. And if we don't get to your question, I think we capture the questions, and I will be glad to write you a response if I have some way of getting in contact with you.
Yeah, that was actually yeah, that's a good point, right? So we'll take a few more questions, and then if we don't get to your question, then I hear Jim saying that please email me and I'll get back to you. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh yeah, that's good service.
More than happy to do that. And if I think if I can find your email, I'll send you an email directly with a response to your question if we don't get to it.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going to happen to the chat once this is over. So maybe a good idea, if you really have that question and you need an answer to that, just encourage you to email Jim directly, right, with the question. Yeah. Okay, it says here, chat and Q&A will be captured. So yeah. There's a very concrete question here from Charles McClure. Can you make a brandy out of maple or birch sap?
Ah, good question. I bet you can. I've never had maple brandy. I'll bet you can, though. Well, I don't know why you couldn't. You know, yeah, I think you can. I make tinctures out of non-timber products. If you see the jars behind me over my head, those are tinctures that are made from the bark of trees that I've got. So yeah, I would say, oh, it says right here, Dave Fuller says, I've seen maple brandy. Yeah.
It's out there. Go find it.
It's there.
Okay. Question here from Lane Johnson. How is it wild blueberry culture is so strong in Maine and New Brunswick, but not in other parts of the eastern US and Canada? The agroecological practices could be the same in other parts of the range of low bushy blueberry, but we don't see the same type of tending practices. So how come we only see that in Maine and New Brunswick?
I think that's a really good question, because why don't we see a lot of, other products that are culturally important as well? Perhaps it's just how people, maybe somebody got motivated and started managing for blueberries in Maine and New Brunswick, and one thing led to another, and they got more and more support for people to manage for these products. If you think about ramps, for example, when people migrated over from Europe, the Europeans came south, they migrated south, and we start calling them ramps because of that. Another group of people came over from the Mediterranean, and they migrated north, and they call them leeks in the north. So they don't call them ramps in the north, and it's purely cultural. It's a cultural thing. So yeah, I would have to ask my colleague, Michelle Baumfleck, who works up in Maine, if she could elucidate on that. I think it's purely cultural, that why some communities in one place, are really into maple syrup, and other places they're not, or some people are really into blueberries.
All right. Next question is from Prudyut Bhattacharya, asking, what is the status of NTFP certification in the US?
I think people are starting to talk more about certification. There are some local programs. I know up in Pennsylvania, there's a program to certify forest farmed medicinal plants. It started in Pennsylvania and it's been expanding, I believe, into Kentucky and West Virginia. So it's slowly taking off. I've not seen the large multinational certification groups certify non-timber forest products in the US, but I see more local, isolated examples of that happening.
All right. Another question here from Kristen Bergstrand. Are you aware of market studies or information available for the decorative materials industry, holiday greens, spruce tops, balsam fir boughs, used for wreaths and garlands and so on?
Right. I'd like to, I have not seen market studies like that for a while. Back in probably the early 2000s, maybe the late 1990s, several people did some really significant and good research on the floral industry and the decorative industry coming out of the Pacific Northwest. If you read some of the work from Schlosser and Blattner, they really produced some really good stuff on the floral industry and the decorative industry out there. But I've not seen anything lately of that. And I think that's one of the challenges with fully understanding the non-timber forest-based economy, is that much of the studies are historical, or they're one-time studies. So there's very little of the continuous monitoring and tracking of these products. And that's really what is one of the things that I think is really needed.
Tom Borak has a comment here. So just like we had the question on tourism, it's related to that. So why is there no mention of honey production?
Good question. I mean,
Yes,
I just overlooked it. I just didn't include it in this. I've not seen any major data on it.
But it's probably a big thing, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, honey production is really big.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, it's so big that they are shipping bees across the country.
Then there's a clarifying question in relation to the oak question that we had in the beginning. Terry Sharik says, I think Kristen was asking if other species in the white oak group, in addition to white oak, can be used for basket making. So,
I don't know, Terry. I don't know if I assume they could. I do know that white oak is preferred because it's easy to split. I don't know about the other species that you're mentioning there, with the bur oak or bur oak. I don't know. It might be. You know, there are a lot of species of trees out there that people are making baskets out of or using that I don't really fully know or aware of. I just know that white oak is the preferred basket for artisans in this area. Okay.
Thanks. Okay, we'll just, time is running out here. It's getting towards 9:30 here, my bedtime. We'll just take one more question and then we'll wrap it up. So the last question here is from Carolina Barotavenia, saying, in Patagonia, Argentina, we are working on promoting the use of wild fungi to add local value. Up till now, mushroom harvest is mediated and local harvesters sell the product to intermediaries. How is that situation in the US? I suppose that relates to how wild fungi is traded in the US.
It's probably very similar. You know, I was just reading an article last week about truffles in Appalachia, down in the forest around near here, and how it's being recognized as a real economic opportunity for people. And I think it's really being promoted locally right now. And you know, with the internet sales, we can buy truffles that are harvested in pretty much anywhere throughout the US and throughout the world, and enjoy that product. So I think, I think it's probably very similar to Argentina, where local people, it's very local. They harvest, they might sell to a local restaurant, you know, they might sell it in a farmer's market or a roadside stand. You know, I think with truffles and fungi in particular, they're really niche markets and specialty markets. So the harvesters are trying to figure out how to get in contact with more high-end specialty vendors. And it's probably very similar to what you're finding in Argentina.
All right, thanks, Jim. So that brings us to the end of the speak here, this webinar today. So thanks a lot, Jim, for taking the time to structure your thoughts and make your presentation, and coming here and sharing this, I think, very rich case with us, and your experiences and your thoughts on how to move ahead. And also for being for connecting NTFPs to the bioeconomy. I really like that. So I think that's really valuable. So thanks a lot
Thanks,
for that,
Karsten.
Jim.